The Intergalactic Academy of Cognitive Sciences on Zentauri Prime had always prided itself on being the galaxy's premier institution for studying the mental capabilities of various species, which was quite the achievement, considering that most of the professors were Zentaurians, a species whose idea of intellectual superiority was roughly equivalent to a peacock's understanding of fashion, all flash, very little substance, but absolutely convinced of their own magnificence. Professor Krennikov was perhaps the most peacock-like of them all, standing 7 feet tall with crystalline blue skin that shimmered when he was particularly pleased with himself, which was always. He had spent the better part of 3 decades developing what he pompously called the Patience Evaluation Protocol. The PEP, as it was known among students who had grown tired of pronouncing Zentaurian academic gibberish, was designed to test the cognitive endurance of what Krennikov delicately termed emerging species. Humans, naturally, fell squarely into this category. The Academy's exchange wing buzzed with the usual mixture of languages, pheromones, and electromagnetic frequencies that passed for conversation among the galaxy's diverse student body. Tall, graceful Altarians floated past with their characteristic air of serene superiority, while stocky Graxian miners argued loudly about the theoretical applications of quantum tunneling in asteroid extraction. In the midst of this controlled chaos sat Marcus Chen, the latest human to brave the Academy's notoriously challenging curriculum. Marcus had the distinctly unimpressed expression of someone who had spent 3 months discovering that advanced galactic civilization often meant the same academic nonsense, but now with more tentacles. He was methodical by nature, possessed of the kind of dry wit that had served humanity well in its diplomatic relations, and was currently wondering if his decision to study xenocognitive theory had been a spectacular mistake. The testing chamber where Krennikov conducted his precious PEP evaluations was a masterpiece of Zentaurian showmanship. Holographic displays covered every surface, cycling through mesmerizing patterns of mathematical equations, geometric forms, and what appeared to be the Zentaurian equivalent of a screensaver from 3 centuries ago. At the center of the room sat the Millennium Puzzle, a device that looked like someone had crossed a Rubik's Cube with a particle accelerator and then asked a committee of interior designers to make it pop. "Today, human Marcus," Krennikov announced, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who believed every word he spoke was worthy of academic publication, "you will attempt to solve what has challenged the finest minds in the galaxy for over 2,000 years. Marcus raised an eyebrow. 2,000 years seemed like an awfully long time for the galaxy's finest minds to struggle with a puzzle, but he had learned not to interrupt Zentaurian monologues. They tended to restart from the beginning if you broke their flow. "The Millennium Puzzle," Krennikov continued, gesturing dramatically at the device, "consists of precisely 1,000 discrete steps, each building upon the previous in a sequence of mathematical, logical, and intuitive challenges that test not merely intelligence, but the deeper cognitive virtue of patience." The assembled class of alien students leaned forward with interest. A few of the Altarians exchanged what might have been knowing glances, though with Altarians it was always hard to tell. Their faces had all the expressiveness of particularly smug marble statues. Each step, Krennikov was warming to his subject now, his crystalline skin beginning to glow with that particular shade of blue that indicated peak academic smugness, requires the solver to demonstrate understanding of principles that build cumulatively. There are no shortcuts, no clever workarounds, no human tendency to, what is your phrase, think outside the box? Marcus nodded politely, though privately he wondered if Krennikov's understanding of human problem-solving came entirely from badly translated tourism brochures. The puzzle itself was undeniably impressive. As Krennikov activated it, the device unfolded like a metallic flower, revealing layer upon layer of interactive surfaces covered in symbols that shifted and changed as Marcus watched. Numbers cascaded across one panel, while geometric shapes rotated on another. A third display showed what appeared to be musical notation. If music could be written in 17 dimensions, "You may begin whenever you feel adequately prepared," Krennikov said, settling into his observation chair with the satisfied air of someone about to watch a particularly entertaining form of academic failure. Marcus approached the puzzle with the kind of careful attention he had learned to apply to anything that glowed ominously in an alien classroom. The first step seemed straightforward enough. A simple mathematical sequence that required him to identify the pattern and provide the next number. Child's play, really, though the symbols were Zentarian, and took him a moment to parse. The second step built on the first, incorporating the solution into a geometric transformation that made the device hum softly and shift its configuration. The third step added a musical component, requiring him to translate mathematical relationships into harmonic sequences. By step 15, Marcus was beginning to understand why this might take a while. By step 30, he was starting to notice something odd. The puzzle was certainly complex, requiring him to juggle multiple types of reasoning simultaneously while keeping track of an increasingly elaborate set of interconnected solutions. But there was something familiar about some of the patterns. Not familiar in the sense that he had seen them before, but familiar in the way that a song you have heard on repeat eventually becomes predictable. Step 43 required him to solve a sequence that seemed remarkably similar to Step 7, though with additional complications layered on top. Step 59 bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Step 12, albeit dressed up in more elaborate mathematical clothing. Marcus paused, ostensibly to consider his next move, but actually to study Krennikov's face. The professor was watching with the intense satisfaction of someone observing a laboratory rat navigate a particularly clever maze. Around the classroom, other students had settled in for what they clearly expected to be a long show. This was interesting. Marcus resumed working, but now he was paying as much attention to the puzzle's underlying structure as he was to the individual problems. He began to notice that certain combinations of solutions seemed to trigger specific responses from the device, not just the expected progression to the next step, but subtle changes in the way subsequent problems were presented. Step 78 was definitely a variation on Step 21. Step 94 looked suspiciously like Step 37, with extra variables thrown in to obscure the similarity. By Step 112, Marcus was no longer solving the puzzle so much as he was analyzing it. He began to suspect that what he was looking at was not a linear sequence of 1,000 unique challenges, but something far more interesting and far more deceptive. The breakthrough came at Step 139. As he input his solution, a complex integration of musical harmony, geometric transformation, and what the Zentarians apparently considered advanced number theory, the device responded with a pattern of lights that Marcus had definitely seen before. Not recently, but definitely before. He ran back through his mental notes of the past 2 hours and found it. Step 14 had produced the exact same response. Marcus felt a familiar sensation, the mental equivalent of tumblers falling into place in a well-designed lock. He was no longer looking at an impossibly complex 1,000-step puzzle. He was looking at what appeared to be a very sophisticated loop. The next 20 steps confirmed his suspicion. Every solution he provided, every response from the device, every apparent progression forward was following a pattern that he had already encountered. The puzzle was not leading him through 1,000 unique challenges towards some ultimate solution. It was cycling him through the same 50 or so fundamental problems, each time dressed up in slightly different mathematical clothing to disguise the repetition. It was, Marcus realized with a mixture of admiration and amusement, really quite clever. Diabolically clever, in fact. The kind of puzzle that could keep someone working for months or even years without ever realizing they were solving the same problems over and over again. The complexity was real, the intellectual challenge was genuine, but the underlying structure was a trap designed to waste the time of anyone who approached it with the assumption that academic complexity equaled academic honesty. Marcus glanced up at Krennikov, who was still watching with that expression of smug anticipation. The professor clearly expected him to spend the next several hours grinding through what he believed to be hundreds of increasingly difficult challenges, growing more frustrated and mentally exhausted until he eventually gave up in defeat. It would be a perfect demonstration of human cognitive limitations, or so Krennikov thought. The question now was how to handle this discovery. Marcus could, of course, simply announce what he had found, but that seemed rather inelegant, and besides, he was curious to see exactly how the loop worked. If he was right about the underlying structure, then he should be able to predict not just the next few steps, but the entire remaining sequence. He decided to run a few tests. Instead of providing the solution that the puzzle seemed to expect, Marcus deliberately input an answer that corresponded to a different point in what he suspected was the loop. The device hesitated for a moment, an interesting response in itself, then reconfigured to present him with the step that should follow his chosen point in the cycle. Perfect. Marcus ran the test twice more, jumping to different points in the sequence and watching the puzzle reconfigure accordingly. Each time the device responded exactly as his theory predicted. The Millennium Puzzle was not a 1,000-step challenge at all. It was, at most, a 50-step sequence disguised as something 20 times larger and infinitely more prestigious. The implications were delicious. Marcus spent the next 30 minutes mapping out the complete structure of the loop, confirming his understanding of how each step connected to the others and how the puzzle managed to disguise its repetitive nature. It really was beautifully designed, the kind of academic fraud that required genuine intelligence to create, even if it was ultimately hollow at its core. By now, several of his classmates were showing signs of restlessness. The Graxians had started a quiet betting pool on how long he would last, while the Altarians maintained their marble statue expressions but had begun to emit the faint electromagnetic hum that indicated either deep meditation or profound boredom. Krennikov, however, was still watching with evident satisfaction. Clearly he had never had a test subject make it this far into his precious puzzle, and he was relishing what he assumed was about to be an epic cognitive breakdown. Marcus decided it was time to end the charade. "Professor Krennikov," he said, not looking up from the puzzle, "I have a question about the nature of this test." Krennikov straightened in his chair, his crystalline skin brightening with pleasure. "Ah, yes, human Marcus. Are you beginning to understand the true scope of the challenge before you? The magnificent complexity that has defeated so many?" "Actually," Marcus said, finally turning to face the prof, "I'm beginning to understand that this puzzle has exactly 47 unique steps, and I've been cycling through them repeatedly for the past hour and a half." The classroom fell silent. Even the Graxians stopped their betting pool to stare. Krennikov's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confused irritation. "I beg your pardon?" "Your Millennium Puzzle," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather, "is a loop. A very sophisticated loop, I'll grant you, but a loop nonetheless. Step 14 produces the same device response as step 139. Step 21 is functionally identical to step 78, just with different variable names. Step 37... "This is impossible," Krennikov interrupted, his skin now flickering between blue and an alarming shade of orange that probably indicated academic panic. "The Millennium Puzzle is a linear progression of unique challenges, each building upon a foundation of carefully disguised repetition," Marcus finished. "It's actually quite brilliant, in a deeply dishonest sort of way. The complexity is real enough to fool casual observation, but the underlying structure is designed to trap the solver in an endless cycle of apparent progress." Marcus turned back to the puzzle and began rapidly inputting solutions, but now instead of working through the sequence step by step, he was jumping around the loop at will, demonstrating his understanding of the device's true structure. Step 12 leads to step 34, which connects to step 41, which cycles back to step 7. The whole system is built on maybe 3 or 4 dozen actual problems, with the rest being variations on the theme. The puzzle, apparently recognizing that its secret had been discovered, began to emit a low whining sound. Krennikov rose from his chair, his skin now flashing in patterns of orange and red that suggested he was approaching either enlightenment or a complete nervous breakdown. "This is... you cannot simply... the calculations alone would require someone to spend months or years working through what they believed to be 1,000 unique steps," Marcus agreed, never realizing that they were solving the same few dozen problems over and over again, each time convinced they were making progress towards some ultimate goal that doesn't actually exist. The classroom erupted in a cacophony of alien languages, as students began rapidly recalculating everything they thought they knew about Zentarian academic achievement. The Altarians were producing their equivalent of shocked gasps, which sounded like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. The Graxians had apparently decided that the betting pool should now focus on how long it would take for Krennikov to spontaneously combust. "But the peer reviews," Krennikov protested, his voice climbing toward frequencies that were probably causing distress to any dogs in the immediate star system. "The academic citations, the prestigious journal publications, all based on the assumption that the puzzle actually worked as advertised," Marcus pointed out. "Did any of your peer reviewers actually solve it, or did they just take your word for its complexity?" The look on Krennikov's face suggested that Marcus had just asked exactly the right question. At this point, the commotion had attracted attention from the hallway. Dean Korth, a particularly large Zentarian whose skin remained a steady diplomatic blue regardless of circumstances, appeared in the doorway, followed by several other faculty members. "Professor Krennikov," Dean Korth said in the tone of someone who had been hoping to avoid this exact conversation for several years, "perhaps you could explain why your classroom appears to be experiencing some form of academic emergency?" Krennikov opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. No sound emerged. His skin was now cycling through a rapid series of colors that probably spelled out either "help me" or "catastrophic system failure" in Zentarian chromatic communication. Marcus took pity on him. "I appear to have discovered that the Millennium Puzzle is not actually a 1,000-step challenge," he explained to the dean. "It's approximately 50 steps arranged in a loop, designed to simulate infinite complexity while actually repeating the same basic problems indefinitely." Dean Korth's skin remained diplomatically blue, but his eyes began to emit the sort of glow that suggested he was performing very rapid mental calculations about damage control and academic liability. "Furthermore," Marcus continued because he was starting to enjoy himself, "the puzzle's design suggests that it was originally created by someone with a rather sophisticated understanding of human psychological patterns. The way it disguises repetition, the manner in which it maintains the illusion of progress, these are techniques that would be most familiar to a species with extensive experience in pattern recognition and recursive problem-solving." One of the newly arrived faculty members, Professor Zextal from the Department of Xenoarchaeology, stepped forward with the expression of someone who had just realized they were about to deliver very unwelcome news. "Dean Korth," Professor Zextal said carefully, "I believe I may need to contribute some additional context to this situation." The dean's skin remained blue, but his eyes began to glow brighter. "Please proceed, Professor Zextal." 3 months ago, while researching early human computational methods for my course on primitive mathematical systems, I discovered several references to something called a Chinese finger trap and various related human puzzle designs from their pre-spaceflight era. The psychological principles underlying these devices, the use of apparent complexity to disguise simple underlying mechanisms, the creation of false progress indicators, the exploitation of solver assumptions about problem structure. These principles appear to be foundational to human puzzle-making traditions. Marcus felt a grin spreading across his face. "You're suggesting that the Millennium Puzzle was originally a human design?" "I am suggesting," Professor Zextal replied, "that Professor Krennikov may have inadvertently based his life's work on what humans would recognize as a particularly sophisticated version of a snipe hunt." The silence that followed this revelation was the kind of silence that occurs when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes that they have been participating in a joke. Krennikov made a sound like a deflating balloon that had learned to speak Zentarian. Dean Korth's skin finally shifted from blue to a pale green that probably indicated either nausea or the early stages of an academic migraine. "Professor Krennikov, perhaps you could join me in my office to discuss the implications of this discovery for your research program, your published papers, and your tenure review, which I believe is scheduled for next month." As the faculty members filed out, followed by a Krennikov who appeared to be considering various career alternatives, Marcus found himself surrounded by his fellow students. The questions came in a rapid-fire mixture of languages and communication methods that roughly translated to various versions of, "How did you figure that out so quickly?" Pattern recognition, Marcus explained. Humans are actually quite good at spotting when something that appears to be moving forward is actually going in circles. We've had a lot of practice. An Altarian student, speaking in the crystalline tones that her species used for particularly important questions, asked, "But did you not feel the urge to continue solving, to push through the apparent repetition in search of the ultimate solution?" Marcus considered this. "Not really. Once I realized it was a loop, continuing to solve it would have been like trying to reach the end of a circle by walking faster." The Graxian who had been running the betting pool clapped Marcus on the shoulder with enough force to rattle his teeth. "Human problem-solving methods are apparently more sophisticated than we assumed. This will require significant updates to our xenocognitive models." As the students gradually dispersed, discussing the implications of the day's revelation in their various native languages, Marcus remained alone with the now silent Millennium Puzzle. The device sat quietly, its holographic displays dark, looking for all the world like a very expensive paperweight that had suddenly realized it was unemployed. Marcus couldn't help but feel a certain sympathy for it. The puzzle itself was genuinely impressive. The engineering required to create such a convincing illusion of infinite complexity was remarkable. It was elegant, sophisticated, and undeniably beautiful in its own way. The only problem was that it had been designed to waste people's time, while convincing them they were making progress toward a goal that didn't exist. Which, when he thought about it, was a pretty accurate description of quite a lot of academic research. The irony was delicious. Professor Krennikov had spent decades developing what he believed to be the ultimate test of cognitive patience and intellectual perseverance, only to discover that his life's work was based on a puzzle-making tradition from the very species he had been trying to prove inferior. The Zentarians, who prided themselves on their advanced understanding of mental challenges, had been thoroughly outsmarted by what amounted to a very elaborate version of a joke that humans had been playing on each other for centuries. Marcus gathered his notes and headed for the door, but paused for one last look at the Millennium Puzzle. Tomorrow, he suspected, there would be committees and investigations and probably a significant amount of very polite academic warfare as the Zentarian faculty tried to figure out how to handle the revelation that one of their most prestigious research programs had been based on what humans would consider a fairly standard example of cognitive misdirection. But today he had learned something valuable about the nature of intelligence, patience, and the dangerous assumption that complexity necessarily indicated sophistication. Sometimes, the most advanced solution to a problem was to recognize that the problem itself was the real challenge. As he walked down the corridor, Marcus could hear the sounds of animated discussion coming from faculty offices and student common areas. The discovery would ripple through the Academy's academic community for weeks, challenging assumptions and forcing everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about cognitive evaluation and species-specific problem-solving approaches. The Intergalactic Academy of Cognitive Sciences would survive this revelation, of course. Academic institutions were remarkably resilient when it came to absorbing embarrassing discoveries about their own methods. But it would be a different institution afterward, one with a healthy respect for the possibility that advanced civilizations might not have a monopoly on sophisticated thinking. And somewhere in the Academy's archives, Marcus suspected, Professor Zextal was probably preparing a very interesting paper on the historical development of human puzzle-making traditions and their unexpected influence on contemporary xenocognitive research. The galaxy, it seemed, was full of loops that appeared to be straight lines. The trick was knowing when to step back and look at the bigger picture. Marcus smiled as he headed toward the dormitory wing, already looking forward to his next xenocognitive theory class. After all, he was starting to suspect that human problem-solving methods might have more to contribute to galactic academic discourse than anyone had previously assumed. The universe, as it turned out, had a sense of humor about these things.